and welcome to our techniques video introducing everything you'll need to know how to do to start your own Phrancko sweater in conjunction with our knit along with Phrancko.com. So these are the sweaters, and I've shown them before. This is a child size, a very small child size, that contains everything that would be in an adult size sweater you might make for yourself. And the pattern, the sample pattern for this is available on Phrancko.com as we speak. If you'd like to take a look at it and read through all the sections and familiarize yourself with what one of these patterns looks like, I'll link to that in the description of this video. In the meantime, I've designed this swatch, which contains all the techniques you might not already be familiar with in your knitting that you'll need to use to make the sweater. The sweater itself is simple and straightforward, but there are some techniques involved that might not be something that a beginning knitter or even an early intermediate knitter has practiced yet. So the purpose of this swatch is to give you a little low-stakes introduction to everything that you need to be familiar with in order to make your own custom-fit sweater. So we're going to begin with a cast-on you might not be familiar with, and it's a provisional crochet cast-on. It's used here in the underarm of the sweater, and is what allows the fabric from the underarm into the arm and the body to continue seamlessly. So let's take a look. The provisional crochet cast-on is typically worked by using your crochet hook to pull thread around the needle you're casting onto, so the stitches are mounted on your needle, ready for you to work. I know that many people find that to be a little bit tricky, so if you can't manage to work it that way, which is shown in the Phrancko videos that are linked to both in the swatch pattern and in the downloadable Phrancko pattern, I will show you another method that I know works well for some of my students. So for this, you're going to want a crochet hook that is about the same size as the needle you're using to make your swatch. I'm working my swatch on a US 8, which is a 6mm needle, and I have a USJ crochet hook, which is typically about 6mm as well. You're also going to want a non-sticky, nice smooth yarn, preferably a superwash if you're working with a wool or a cotton, a synthetic, something that isn't going to felt up into your stitches and or be difficult to pull out later because the cast-on is provisional. And it's good to have a provisional cast-on scrap yarn that is slightly lighter than the yarn you're using to knit your swatch for this version of the crochet provisional cast-on. So rather than casting on directly to the needle, what we're going to be doing is making the chain and then picking stitches up into it. So according to our swatch directions, we need a provisional cast-on of 10 stitches. So I'm going to add 2 stitches to each end of that and cast on a chain of 14 stitches. If you're not familiar with how to make a crochet chain just yet, if you're primarily a knitter and don't do much crochet or haven't tried much crochet, there are 100 great videos for making chains out there. So look one of those up on YouTube and you'll find them quite easily. It's important to work relatively loosely at this point because we don't want to distort our stitches in the cast-on by picking up into something that's worked too tightly. That's also why we're using a slightly lighter weight yarn, to allow our stitches that we knit into this to be the size that the needle wants them to be, rather than the size the cast-on wants them to be. Once you have all your chain, just snip your tail, and this last loop coming out of the chain, just pull that string all the way through, and that will secure your cast on until you want to remove it later. So if you look at the top of a crochet chain, you'll see a series of lined up V's that interlock with one another that look somewhat like one column of knitting. And if you turn that over, you'll see what many people refer to as the spine of the crochet chain, a series of little bumps coming out of the backs of the stitches. Those are what we're going to be picking our knit stitches for our first row of knitting up into. So this is the provisional cast on. And we're going to pick up stitches into it to make row 1 of our swatch. This is also a method that is good practice for the gesture of picking up and knitting stitches, which you will need to do at several points during the construction of a Phrancko sweater. So it's also a little bit of good practice there. So all I'm going to be doing is, you see on my little chains here, you see the little lumps on top. I'm going to skip a couple of those. Those are my edge just for safety. And I'm going to knit 1 stitch into each of these bumps. The yarn I'm using is a non-superwash wool. It's very, very sticky. So that is the reason it's particularly important to use a nice, smooth, non-sticky yarn for the cast on. Because if I left this swatch somewhere, it could possibly felt up on me and then be difficult to remove the provisional cast on later. So I'm inserting into one of those spine bumps, wrapping my yarn around the needle, and pulling up a stitch. That is the simple gesture that you make for picking up and knitting. And I'm going to do that 10 times across. Missed. Nine. And my last one here. I split that. 10 stitches. So there you have it. 10 stitches worked into my provisional crochet cast on. Now this chain itself is the cast on. These stitches I just picked up are technically my first row of knitting. According to our swatch pattern, I need to knit 20 rows of stockinette, beginning with a right side row. I've just knit the first of those rows. That's my first right side row. I'll knit my next 19 rows of stockinette, and then we'll see what the next section has for us. The next section of our swatch has us practicing the make one increases that are used here as we shape the front neckline of the sweater. Let's take a look at those. Make one increases are generally in the second wave of increases a new knitter might learn. You'll probably do the knit front and back first, yarn overs, of course. But make one increases are lovely and useful because they are a set of directional increases. By directional, we mean there are two matching symmetrical versions of this increase. One that leans towards the left and one that leans towards the right. And we use both of those increases in the Phrancko sweater, where you might be doing something new, even if you're quite familiar with make one left and make one right increases, is the Phrancko sweater pattern will also call for making one left and right purlwise. That may sound daunting or strange, but there's actually nothing to it. If you can already make a make one left or make one right, you're doing the same gestures, but purling the resulting stitch. So let's take a look at make one right and make one left, and I'll throw some ways to help you remember which one you're making and what they look like. So if you are new to making make ones, you don't have to keep referring to your stitch pattern instructions at the beginning of your patterns. So the make one increases section of this swatch, the first row says knit 2, make 1 left, knit to 2 stitches from the end, make 1 right, knit to end. So let's do that. Let's see how that looks. I'm going to begin this row by knitting 2 stitches. And then I'm going to make 1 left. So in both of the make 1 increases, you're taking that strand of yarn between 2 stitches, placing it up on your needle, and then knitting through it. You can remember which one you're making with a little phrase I like to tell my students, which is, if you're not right in front, you'll be left behind. And what this means is a little mnemonic to help you remember which strand of the yarn you'll be knitting. To make a make 1 right, you'll knit into the front of a stitch you pull up. And to make a make 1 left, you'll knit into the back. So again, that's if you're not right in front, you'll be left behind. So we need to make 1 left first. I'm going to put this strand of yarn up onto my needle for me to get ready to knit. Now, if you look here, another way you can tell that you've pulled up the stitch the right way, let's put my needle back in my knitting, is that when you pull the needle up, or the loop up on the needle, it will point up and in the direction of the increase you'll be making. This is a make 1 left, and this strand points up and to the left. So I know it's correct. So I'm going to knit that through the back. It is left behind. And now I'm going to knit to 2 stitches from the end. That was fast. Here we are. And I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to make a make 1 right. When I have the strand pulled up, the strand in front of the needle points up and to the right. It's going up and to the right, so I know that's correct. And according to my mnemonic, I'll be right in front. That's a make 1 right. And now I finish my row. Now for the part that may be less familiar for some of you. This may have been totally unfamiliar for you, in which case the next part will be just as unfamiliar, so nothing lost there. But this purlwise increase might seem different or strange if you're used to the regular knitted make ones, but there's really nothing to it. The same rules apply. So I've turned my knitting over. The row 2 of the make 1 increases section tells us to purl 2, make 1 right purlwise, purl to 2 stitches from the end, make 1 left purlwise, and purl to the end. So let's do that. I'm going to purl 2, and I'm going to make 1 right purlwise. Same rules apply. There's my running thread. I'm going to pull that up onto my needle. It is pointing up and to the right, so I know it's pointing the correct direction for my make 1 right increase. And I can remember I will be right in front. And then I simply insert to purl, purl that new stitch. It gets twisted nicely so it doesn't make a hole. And then I carry on knitting, purling actually, to 2 stitches from the end. Here we, oh no, one more. Now here we are. So, same deal here. I'm going to place that up on my needle. You'll see it is the new strand that I put on is going up and to the left. And I will be left behind. It's a make 1 left purlwise. This is a little more tricky of a gesture. You have to come around to that back loop and purl it in the back. So you see, I'm coming around into the back loop there, executing my purl stitch, and purling to the end of the row. That's really all there is to it. The purl-wise make one increases are the same directionality as their knit-wise counterparts. You can see that both of these, I don't know if you can see that in there, that's one of my make ones. That's the make one knit-wise I did, pointing up that direction, up and to the left. Here's the make one purl-wise that I did on the right side, and it's got the strand pointing in the exact same direction as its knit-wise counterpart. Pretty clever. So just remember, if you're not right in front, you'll be left behind, and you can check that the strand you pulled up onto your needle is mounted the correct way by looking at that strand and seeing it's pointing up to the left or up to the right. Our swatch pattern calls for us to repeat these rows once more, so I'm going to do that, and then we'll continue. The next section of our swatch includes the cable cast on, which is used at the back and front necks of the Phrancko sweater. Let's take a look at how to make those. The cable cast on is recommended in the Phrancko sweater pattern because it's a nice structural cast on. The places where you use this cast on at the front and back necks are places that carry the entire weight of your sweater, actually. So rather than using a nice stretchy elastic cast on you might use in the middle of the row, like a backward loop cast on or a knitted on cast on, or even a provisional cast on that you can take out later when you put on the collar, for example, the cable cast on gives you a nice firm edge. It creates part of the structure of the sweater. And that's why the designer Frank chose to recommend that particular cast on. And while much of the sweater's techniques are completely customizable and you can switch things out for, you could use different increases if you wanted something decorative, or you could use a regular cast on in the underarm if you didn't like making provisional cast ons. But the cable cast on is really something that you should put in the sweater. It doesn't need much customization because you don't see it in the finished sweater, but it does give you the structure you need to keep the sweater up on your shoulders and hold the weight of the rest of the body. So here's how it works. I'm working the first cable cast on row, and I've already knit across. So once I knit across, what I'm going to do is turn my work. And then, to perform the cable cast on, you insert your needle in between the first and second stitches on your left-hand needle, like so. I'm not going into either of those stitches, I'm going between them. Wrap the yarn around the needle, pull a stitch out, and then without twisting it, place it up on the left-hand needle. I say that this is something you want to do with what I call baby bird tension. Think about pulling your yarn in such a way, with as much tension as you would use to hold a baby bird that you didn't want to get away from you, but you also didn't want to hurt. You do not want to crush your baby bird, but you don't want it to be able to get away from you either. So you're putting your stitches on and keeping your tension nice and even and snug, but not pulling the living daylights out of it. It becomes very difficult to work, and you might not find that the gauge, particularly along the back neck and the front neck where there's a long period of cable cast on stitches, your gauge might go off if you're making them too tight, but you don't want them too loose either. And you simply continue on in this way, inserting between the first and second stitches on the left-hand needle and pulling up a stitch and placing it on the left-hand needle tip. I find that once I snug up the stitches, I don't stick the barrel of my needle all the way through, like so. I just place the tip through. It's always nice to work on the tip of your needle in order to avoid distorting your stitches anyhow. But this is a time when it's a particularly good practice. So we cast on 5 stitches. Let me count that. That's my first one, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've cast on 4, and then I cast on 1 more. Once I cast on my 5th stitch, I simply purl back across the row according to row 2 of my pattern, and you simply work these as normal stitches. So I'm going to purl back across these, and when I'm at the end of the row, I will turn the work again and use the cable cast on to cast on 5 more stitches on the other side of my swatch. So let's hurry and get across here. Now that I'm at the end of my purl row, I simply repeat the same steps. I'm going to turn my work, insert the tip of my right hand needle between the first and second stitches on my left hand needle, pull a loop through without twisting it, and place it on my left hand needle, and continue that until I've cast on 5 stitches. After I've completed the cast on section, the pattern instructs me to knit stockinette for 10 rows. So I will see you after I do that. We're almost finished with the main body of our swatch, so we're going to finish up with short rows. These may be a technique you've heard of, and if you haven't tried them yet, they couldn't be more straightforward. Short rows can seem scary and mystifying if you've never done them before, but really it is as simple as not working across an entire row before you turn and work back. And it creates sections where one part of the knitting has more rows in it than another, and it's one way you make shaping in a sweater. In the Phrancko sweater, we use it to make the shoulders for the drop in the shoulders around the neck. If you are customizing your sweater, other places you might use short rows on your own could be the bust, if you're adding bust darts. If you have a much larger bust than your upper bust measurement would indicate, you could make extra fabric in the front of your sweater by using short rows. That's not included in the Phrancko pattern, but if you're comfortable with it, it's one way to customize your sweater. You can also add short rows in the back hem to create a sort of rounded hemline. There are a lot of places where this skill is useful. The Phrancko pattern is written with wrap and turn short rows, but this is a place where you could customize to your taste. If you prefer, say, German or Japanese short rows, and you know how to do the conversion in a pattern, you can easily do that yourself. But let's take a look at the wrap and turn short rows that are included in the instructions. So on this swatch, in the first short row, we're going to knit 6, 4, 5, 6, and we're going to do our first wrap and turn. And we do that like so. We're going to slip the next stitch, move the yarn from the back between the tips of the needles to the front, slip that stitch back onto the left-hand needle, and return the working yarn to the back of the work. Then we are going to turn our work and purl back to the beginning of the row. So those first 6 rows, or 6 stitches, were the extent of our short row. We're just making little wedges on this sample. So now that I'm back at this edge, the next row of this section simply has me knitting back across. But I'm going to need to pick up the wrap. The reason we wrap in the wrap and turn is because if you don't do anything to connect the knitting in the place where you've turned, you'll be left with a little hole. Some patterns use this for a decorative touch, maybe not on the shoulder of your sweater though. So I'm going to knit these 6 stitches. And I come to the wrapped stitch. See, this is the stitch we slipped back and forth. This is the little wrap on it. All I'm going to do is insert my needle into that wrap and pick it up and knit it together with the stitch that was slipped. Then with a little bit of zhuzhing, the slipped stitch moves to the front, and we've got some continuous knitting, and it disguises it perfectly. So now I will knit to the end, and we'll see how the process of making a short row looks on the purl side of the fabric. So this functions the same way, but facing the other direction. Go figure. So I'm going to purl 6 stitches to begin this row. Now, to wrap and turn on the purl side, slip the stitch to the right-hand needle, move the working yarn around that stitch from the front to the back between the needle tips, slip that stitch back to the left-hand needle, and pull the working yarn back to the front of the work through the needle tips. I can turn my work and knit back. And then I will resolve the wrap and turn the same way on the purl side. So I'm going to purl those first 6 stitches, and then I will come to the wrapped stitch, pick up the wrap, and purl it together with that slipped stitch. 4, 5, and 6. Here's my stitch. Here's the wrap. It's easy to put it up on the needle that way. Give that a purl, and then purl across the rest of the row. So let me purl across, and then we'll turn this over and take a look. Despite the fact that I've put this at the end of this first section of the swatch, the main body of this swatch, it's the first special kind of stitch that you do when making a Phrancko sweater. It actually, short rows begin on row 2, I think. And row 2 can look a little bit complicated, but Frank has done a very good job of giving you clear written instructions, as well as including a link to a diagram that makes what the short rows are doing at the shoulders very, very clear. So here are our short rows. We haven't made big short rows, but now the top of the, you can see here where it's on the cable, the corners of the top of our swatch here are a little taller than the center. So There's the short row, and if you look quite carefully, you can see that right in here, there's one more row worth of knitting than in the rest of the swatch. So at this point, the swatch just calls for us to block, or to bind off this section, and then block this part of the swatch. The reason we block this before practicing any of the pickup stitches is because it will make it much easier to calm our stitches down. See, this has become a tube, and we're going to be picking up here afterward. So if I block this, calm this selvage down, make all the stitches nice and even and lay straight, I'll be doing myself a big favor when it comes time to pick up stitches in this area to make our ribbing and to practice our bind off. So that's why we're going to block next. So I'm going to bind this off, get it in the blocking water, and then we'll take a look at picking up stitches. Now that we've knit and blocked the body of our swatch, we're going to practice picking up stitches, making some ribbing, and the bind off that we use. Picking up stitches might be the most intimidating part of the sweater, but with a little bit of practice, you'll be great at it in no time. When picking up stitches in a Phrancko sweater, you'll be picking up both into the selvage of rows and directly into columns of stitches along cast on edges. So we're going to pick up stitches along this curved area. So we'll turn our swatch 90 degrees. Your crochet cast on should be over here on the right of the work. And when you're picking up stitches to rows, you generally pick up in some kind of ratio, meaning that because stitches in knitting are wider than they are tall, you're going to pick up fewer stitches than there are rows. You'll have to skip some of the rows. Typically, stockinette stitches ratio is something around 5 stitches to 7 rows. And when we make this swatch, we'll just make the assumption that that is the correct ratio. When picking up stitches yourself in your own project, it's always good to measure your gauge and double check. And there are a lot of videos out there about measuring your ratios to pick up stitches correctly. But for the sake of this swatch, where really our goal is just to learn the gesture of picking up stitches, we will assume that 5 stitches to 7 rows is correct. So we are going to pick up along the selvage here first. And what we're going to do is for every 5 stitches that we pick up, we're going to need to skip 2 spaces where we could pick up. Now, depending on the yarn that you use, it might be somewhat difficult to really understand what's happening with the anatomy of the stitches in your selvage. And that's just a true thing about selvages in general. Because the strands of yarn don't have neighbors to hold on to make them look nice and even, selvage stitches tend to be kind of ugly and messy, which is why we often hide them in seams. For if you're having difficulty figuring out where exactly you should be putting your needle to pick up stitches, here's my advice. Don't look at the selvage stitches at all. Instead, look for the first column of nice-looking normal stitches, 1 stitch in from the selvage, and you'll be picking up next to those. So here's my column, my first column of nice stitches, and I'm going to be picking up stitches into here, right next to them. So, for the sake of this swatch, the first thing I'm going to do is pick up and knit 23 stitches in this pattern. I'm going to pick up and knit 3, so I've picked up a stitch right here. I'm just going to go to the next stitch and pick up and knit a stitch next to that one 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Now I'm going to skip my first stitch. This is where I would pick up the next stitch, but I'm going to skip that one, go into the next one, and pick up and knit 2. And now I'm going to skip one more stitch, because that will give us 5 stitches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, over 7 rows of knitting. So I'm going to skip this guy and go right into here. And I'm going to continue this. Pick up and knit 3. Skip 1. Pick up and knit 2. Skip 1. Pick up and knit 3. Skip 1. Pick up and knit 2. Now, I'm getting to this portion where the selvage is slanting outward because of where we put our make one increases. I'm just going to continue in my ratio. If you were picking up something in a project that had a long diagonal section, you would want to recalculate your ratio by measuring exactly how long that diagonal portion is. At the front of the neck, where you use these increases for neck shaping, in the Phrancko sweater, it really doesn't go on for long enough to make a real difference to your gauge. So I just continue in my ratio that I've established until I get to these cast on stitches. So 2, I'm going to skip 1 and then pick up 3. 1, 2, 3. All right. Skip 1. Now, I have made my way all the way to these cast on stitches. These are my cable cast on stitches. I'm just going to pick up in a 1-for-1 on these. For each stitch in this cast on section, I'm going to pick up 1 stitch. And there are 2 ways to do this, and you will probably wind up using them both in your Phrancko sweater. You can either pick up into the stitches themselves. So I've got the little V's here. You'd pick up into each of those, and the stitches will carry on seamlessly. You would do this at around the neck, for example, when you're picking up the collar. At the shoulders, at the beginning, the pattern instructs you to pick up between stitches. And you do that because if you pick up into the stitches themselves, they get offset by half a stitch when you're picking them up, when you're knitting in 2 different directions away from a cast on. So by picking up between the stitches, we don't have to do any fussy things where we make an extra stitch and decrease it. So for the sake of this swatch, you can practice either way, either picking up the stitches in the middle of each stitch or between 2 stitches. So I'm just going to pick up my last 5 stitches here. And for the sake of this, I will pick up between. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So when you're done picking up stitches in this section, you should have an odd number of stitches. Let me try and get that again. You should have an odd number of stitches because we're going to knit some ribbing. If by chance you have picked up an even number of stitches, pick up 1 more somewhere or drop 1 off just to practice. So now, once we've picked all these up, we're going to follow our pattern by flipping the work over. We're working flat for a minute, and we're just going to knit 5 rows of 1-1 ribbing. And then we'll take a look at the bind off. Finally, let's take a look at the special sewn bind off that you can use on the ribbing of your sweater. And here we are, the invisible ribbed bind off. Now, like much of the sweater, this is also a customizable option. If you like the look of the invisible ribbed bind off, by all means, use it. If you don't, if you have another edge treatment you like to make, you can do that as well. If you find this bind off too tricky or fussy, you can just bind off in pattern. If you've chosen to do something other than ribbing, like a garter stitch edge, for example, just put your bind off in. But let's take a look at the invisible rib bind off as written. This is also sometimes called a tubular bind off or a sewn Kitchener bind off. And you can find lots of videos about it out there, including the Phrancko tutorial that I've linked to in the pattern. Now, we begin with some setup. And what's important to distinguish when doing a Kitchener stitch bind off is inserting your tapestry needle purlwise versus knitwise. So as if to knit is from the front to the back, and as if to purl is from the back to the front, like so. Your tail needs to be at least 3 times as long as what you're binding off. If you do it just at 3 times as long, you might be in for an unpleasant surprise as you run out of tail towards the end of your sewn bind off. So I do upwards of 4 times the amount, just because I don't want to have to cut a new length or try and pull the whole thing out. Another reason you might choose to do a different bind off is if you're using a textured yarn, something fuzzy, to make your sweater, you might find it very difficult to unpick a sewn bind off should a mistake occur. So that's one reason you might consider another bind off. But this does make a very, very lovely finished edge. So let's take a look. We set up by inserting into the first knit stitch as if to purl and pull that nice and snug. Again, it's that baby bird tension. You want it snug, you don't want it to get away from you, but you don't want to strangle it. Now, this is the part that is a little confusing in written instructions, but it's actually not so bad. What we're going to do to go into the first purl stitch is take our needle, come behind the work, and insert that needle to the front between the first knit and first purl stitches. We'll pivot around and pull into the first purl stitch as if to knit. It's a little difficult to see, but we'll continue on and I'll show you again. That was the setup. So here's how I work this and my little chant. Now we go to the stages we repeat. We're going to insert into the first stitch as if to purl, skip 1 stitch, we're going to insert in the first stitch as if to knit, skip 1 stitch, and insert as if to purl. So we insert as if to knit, pull that first stitch off, and then skip 1 stitch into the next one as if to purl, and pull tight. We're going to insert into this first purl stitch as if to purl and pull it off the needle, and then skip this stitch, come between the 2 from the back, and around as if to knit. I'm kind of speeding through this because there are a lot of very, very good tutorials out there that are better than mine. So here's my little chant. We're going to knit off, skip, purl, pull tight, and then purl off, skip, knit, and pull tightly. again. That's knit off, skip, purl, and then purl off, skip, knit. Knit off, skip, purl, purl off, skip, knit. Knit off, skip, purl off, skip, knit, and so on. So here's another little hint. I know from a brioche class that I've taught before where we use a similar bind off to this, that some people, particularly if your hands get stiff, have a bit of trouble with this gesture where you come in and use your needle to go around. And here's the thing. This bind off is structurally identical to the Kitchener stitch that you might use on the toe of a sock or something. And with a set of extra DPNs, you can arrange your stitches for the regular Kitchener stitch and bind off that way. And we'll do that by taking 2 DPNs and arranging the knit columns onto the front needle, and try not to knock them off, and the back stitches, or the purl stitches, onto a back needle. And we'll just transfer our stitches that way. Knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. And once you've transferred some stitches, you can push these down towards the end. And now you can simply bind off using the regular Kitchener stitch pattern that you might already be familiar with, and for which many, many lovely tutorials exist that are beyond my capability to imitate. So I know that that's been useful for some students who are familiar with the Kitchener stitch and find the gesture of moving the needle in this way a little tiresome for their hands. So you can mount your stitches onto 2 needles like this and do the regular Kitchener stitch bind off. So I'm going to finish binding off here, and my swatch will be finished. And that's it. Here's our finished swatch. So it has everything: the crochet cast on, make one increases knit-wise and purl-wise, the cable cast on, starting from both a knit side and a purl side, some short rows, so you can see the shape that they've put into our swatch here, picking up stitches along rows and stitches, and our fancy bind off, which gives a nice continuous edge that seems to roll over the edge of the work. So those are all the special techniques you might need to make the sweater. So again, we've got links to download the swatch pattern. We've got links to download the sample pattern from Phrancko.com so you can see where all these techniques are used throughout the sweater. And we hope you'll join us next time as we take a small tour through the Phrancko.com website. We'll see you then.